Revive the Great Mother, we pray.
On to this blasphemous altar I do summon her, the one who shall live again. Ego sum te perto, noedo coor.
Hey guys!
And she's back! 95 BFM's prodigal red-hot mama Camilla Martin makes a welcome return to our airwaves, taking Thursday Drive by the horns like a pro. A little older, a little wiser, but no less rambunctious, Camilla Martin is back in the hot seat for what promises to be our craziest Thursday Drive yet. Thanks, of course, to the sexy beast that is the King's Arms.
Our wire.
You're listening to The Wire. I'm not even going to begin to explain what happened there. But needless to say, we have moved on to our next topic, which is we're talking to Selwyn Manning from livenews.co.nz. Now, this week we're talking about an agreement that the government has signed with NATO. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, an organisation that was set up at the height of the Cold War to combat Russian aggression. Anyway, I've got Selwyn on the line. Selwyn, what have you got to add?
Yeah, hi Simon. Yeah, this week John Key travelled to London for the Queen's shenanigans up there, but while he was up there he travelled from London to North Europe where he signed New Zealand up to a NATO security agreement. The name of this agreement is Individual Partnership Cooperation Program, or commonly known as an IPCP, for those who like those kind of things. Now, this IPCP was agreed to after NATO nations held a special meeting in Chicargo in May. New Zealand attended that meeting. Now, the topics at that meeting included a coordinated exit strategy regarding Afghanistan, that conflict up there, and also, obviously, Syria came up on the subject of negotiations and discussions there, Simon.
Right, so what do we know about this agreement in terms of what does it commit New Zealand to?
Yeah, okay. Now that's where it starts to get difficult because there's been very little discussion, if not nothing, leading up to New Zealand being signed up to this. The government has largely been keeping this thing under wraps and quiet. What we do know, Simon, is the IPCP pact assures NATO of New Zealand's commitment to NATO security efforts and includes cooperation in cyber defence. For example, the document also refers to defence disaster relief, crisis management, joint education and joint training. One would imagine that that's military joint training amongst the NATO nations. So New Zealand is seen to, according to the Secretary-General of NATO, as a key partner in all these areas, and that other countries in this kind of category that are not strictly speaking members of NATO, that North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, but are signed up in this cooperative pact. They include Switzerland and Sweden, and now New Zealand as well. In the immediate short term, what we know is what's on the agenda for NATO is tidying up where, remember, most recently we saw a NATO-led action against Libya's Gaddafi regime in Libya up there that resolved with Gaddafi's regime being overturned, one from people on the ground, the uprising within the country, and the military and airstrikes provided by NATO. In past weeks also what we have seen is NATO's preoccupation with Syria, as is the concerns of most humanitarian kind of efforts around the world. We've seen the United Nations Security Council blocked from inside, really, from making a move against those who are committing atrocities in Syria. The Security Council's divided on that, where the United States and West-leaning states favour an intervention in Syria, while Russia and China currently favour a diplomatic solution. So we know that that situation at the United Nations Security Council remains untenable. Something's got to give, and I guess, when you're looking at New Zealand signing up to this, once again we look at in analysing this key kind of issues that have popped up on a timeline, and Simon, clearly what we can see is that we see New Zealand once again signing this security pact with NATO. We see NATO's Secretary-General announcing this week that he's travelling to Australia in the next week, expecting a similar deal to be signed with Australia. We saw this week the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, in Beijing, and he was signing a defence and security pact with China. It starts to kind of put out a picture there where, all these moves where New Zealand's kind of embedding in, if you like, in a more structured, coordinated and committed sense to the Western Alliance security agreements. I mentioned China and Russia just then as a demonstration of what some would refer to as the world moving from a security sense to a more bipolar kind of strategic arrangement, if that makes sense, Simon.
So what does New Zealand have to offer NATO? The first thing that pops to mind is we've got the Waihopo spy base and intelligence gathering, and we're already linked into, I think it's what they call the echelon system.
That's
intelligence
right.
Gathering.
Yeah, there's much more too. Clearly New Zealand doesn't have the numbers to make a significant impact as far as soldiers are concerned in such NATO-led kind of security, manoeuvres. But what it does do is it has a very respectable vote in the UN. Remember that New Zealand has been one where it's paraded and punched above its weight on humanitarian kind of issues. But beyond that, it's considered still in many circles globally to have a strong independent stance on issues where it can speak up to the morality of intervention.
Yeah, now morality is a good point here. It's the 25th anniversary of us being nuclear free.
Yeah.
Is signing up to NATO our get out of jail free card with the states in terms of the difficulties that policy has had?
Well, the policy's been less of a rock in the road with the United States for some time now. We saw, I remember an interview I did myself with a former Associate Secretary of State up in Fiji, the US Associate Secretary of State, Mr. Hill. Now, he was saying back then in the mid-2000s that it was no longer a rock in the road, and New Zealand had much to offer in arguing the case for nuclear non-proliferation around the globe. But what we can see here is, what we've been signing up to are signals that, one, we want to take our independent morality message to the world, but we are giving away that a strong argument of independence when we've signed up to Western security alliances in such a forthright and public way. It seems a giant leap away from the independent position, for example, that New Zealand maintained right through from 1984, 1985, 1986 to the end of the Helen Clark-led government in 2008, where New Zealand, for example, the United States was pushing all countries around the world to join it in its advance against Iraq in 2003. Australia joined that effort. New Zealand said, no, it's not UN mandated, so we're not going to. Now, New Zealand, since then, since the national-led government came into power, it's signed up to the Wellington Declaration, which was a signatory document between the United States' Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and New Zealand Prime Minister John Key, where it bedded New Zealand into United States security interests much closer than it ever had been before in the post-ANZUS period. But if we look at all of this and what is going on, what we can see is that these big powers want New Zealand on side. They want as many votes in the UN as they possibly can. If there is a bipolar kind of structure opening up within the United Nations Security Council, and we can see that with China and Russia on one side and all the other nations on the other, then it wants as many people, many countries, in support of its efforts should things go awry, for example, in Syria. So if we look at the big picture, and these questions are really, these points are really questions Simon and I'm going to make mention of here, and they remain open to speculation. But what is the common enemy that New Zealand and NATO and now New Zealand would face.
NATO is an interesting institution. It seems to have migrated a long way off its original purpose, which was to protect Western Europe from Soviet encroachment. And now it seems to have, it's in Afghanistan, for instance.
Yes.
And the definition of security seems to have been broadened significantly.
I think you've hit your nail on the head with NATO. What it's become in the post-George Bush period, so under Obama, is NATO has become a vehicle for, US-led and EU-led, European Union-led manoeuvres against other states that they would consider rogue states outside of the UN apparatus, where the UN can slow things down because it needs to get a consensus at the Security Council level. The NATO forces can actually make a move and weather the storm, if you like, politically and diplomatically. We know that around the world there are many areas that are becoming concerns for the Western Alliance and the NATO member countries, and this is basically what New Zealand is signing up to here. Is there a common enemy that states, where states that the Western Alliance consider rogue states? Are they kind of Syria? Are they Iran, Nigeria and Yemen? Are these all coming into the picture? We can see when we analyse and look at things globally that they are the areas that are of most concern to the United States and NATO. Are we seeing, for example, an emergence once again of this bipolar world? You've mentioned a couple of times the Soviet period. Are we seeing an emergence of a new bipolar world where you've got on one side the Western ideals around a multilateral pact like NATO and offset while China, Russia and other non-aligned states kind of offer a counterbalance to that. And it does appear that that's the picture that is emerging at this stage, Simon. Really, they're unanswered questions, and it's one where you would expect that the Prime Minister on his return to New Zealand would address these, if not to the media, not to the public, certainly within the Parliament, and one would hope so.
Now, finally, in terms of this agreement, are there, I think I've talked to you about this before, but are there what they call secret annexes to it? Does the public, will they know everything about it, do you think?
No, they won't. And I think these kind of documents are intentionally that way. They are written in a way where they're fairly broad, which gives member states room to move should they wish to, and they are ambiguous to a degree. And now, when they mention cyber defence, the NATO Secretary General referred to how Estonia was attacked through cyber attacks and brought down its civil institutions, and that how NATO member countries consider cyber attacks on a grand scale like that to be significant attacks on a country. It's not just considered a computer attack; it's considered an attack on the jurisdiction of a particular state. So there are big things here that are coming through, and most reasonably minded people would think, yep, sweet, that's fine. New Zealand can get in there, it can do its bit. We're good at IT, we're good at thinking, we've got an independent spirit. We can address some of the things and work in a cooperative kind of plan with allies, if you like, that have like kind of values and humanitarian values. But it's the bigger picture which does not come into the reading of the document. It doesn't describe, for example, a NATO-led manoeuvre outside of UN control and how that actually ropes in New Zealand now and binds New Zealand to its commitment. It does mention in context how what it wanted was, while we're kind of in that exit strategy period of getting out of Afghanistan, the NATO wanted New Zealand to be a part of those nations where, should things go awry on the same kind of level again in the future, New Zealand could be relied on to contribute. So that's what we have agreed to. The detail, it's still, the devil's in the detail, and we don't know it, Simon.
Great. Well, Selwyn, thank you very much for your time yet again, and we'll be back in touch next week.
Okay, mate. Take care.
Thank you.
Our Wire.
That was Selwyn Manning from livenews.co.nz.